My name is Michelle, and I'm from the Center for Livable Cities. The center was jointly established by the Ministry of National Development and the Ministry of the Environment and Water Resources in 2008 to distill, create, and share knowledge on livable and sustainable cities. The CLC lecture series is one of the platforms through which urban thought leaders share best practices and exchange ideas and experience. In today's session, we are honored to have with us Professor Susan Feinstein, Senior Research Fellow at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and Professor Norman Feinstein, President Emeritus and Professor Emeritus of Sociology and Urban Studies at Connecticut College. The lecture will examine the dilemmas of achieving a just and globally competitive city and how Singapore and other cities can learn to deal with this as we progress into the future. The lecture will be moderated by Associate Professor Kenneth Paul Tan, Vice Dean of Academic Affairs at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy of the National University of Singapore. Today's lecture is a little bit different from the usual CLC lecture series. There will be no individual presentations, but panelists will be seated, and both Professor Susan and Norman Feinstein will start with sharing their insights on this topic, followed by a moderated dialogue with Associate Prof Tan, and lastly, ending with a Q&A session with the audience. Without much further ado, we would now like to invite all our panelists on stage, please. I will now hand the time over to Associate Prof Tan and the panelists.
Thank you, Michelle. And good afternoon to all of you. So the title that we have up here is really loaded, isn't it? A just city or global city. It's one or the other. I'd like to challenge, I think, our speakers, Norman and Susan and everyone here, to go beyond the dichotomy of either or, and see if it is at all possible theoretically and in practice to be both a global city and a just city. But to do that, let's not jump into the question straight away, because it's very tempting to do today in Singapore, to point to lots of things that are going on and give a conclusion to a very charged question like that. Instead, what I'd like to do is for us to think of this 1.5 hours in terms of two segments. The first, focusing really on the theory that Susan has developed over many years now of the just city, to allow some of that theory to breathe a little bit before we actually get into the second segment, when we'll talk about very specific things about the Singapore system and how we might view those things through the lens of the just city and make critical assessments of it. And so how I'd like to do it is in the first half for Susan to maybe spend about 10 minutes or so, reminding us about some of the key features of her theory of the just city. We'll have a little bit of a conversation, and then we'll open up to some questions on the theoretical aspects. And then in the second half, we'll ask Norman to speak about some aspects of Singapore through this theory of the just city. And then I think the second half is probably going to be a longer half, and we'll have much more question and answer from you in that second half. So can I invite Susan to start us off?
Thank you, Kenneth. First of all, let me say that we had originally entitled this panel both a just city and a global city, but it was thought that that didn't sound nearly as interesting. And in order to really attract attendance, it would be better to make it sound more like a challenge. But what I want to do first is talk about what we mean by a global city. I would argue that Singapore is actually not, in many respects, a global city, although it is certainly a competitive city, and the two terms are not entirely synonymous. The term global city became current in social science research with the book by Saskia Sassen of that name, The Global City, She particularly characterized global cities as the site in which financial services and then what she calls advanced services or producer services. That is, services which aren't your local accountant or your local travel agent, but rather services which are sold to businesses. So we're talking about corporate accounting, corporate law, architecture for very big buildings. So those are what she means by advanced services, and that it was the cluster of finance and these advanced or producer services which created certain cities' prominence within the global economy, because these are the cities where decisions that affect everybody else in the world are made. So somebody in New York, in a tower on Wall Street, pushing a button on a computer which sends millions of dollars to Bangalore to develop a hotel would be an example of the way in which decisions in global cities affect other parts of the world. So in global cities, then, there's this clustering of business and financial services. And the reason for the clustering, and economists talk about this a lot for this agglomeration, is that it enables face-to-face encounters for the making of deals. There's been some literature that says, well, these are the places where ideas are in the air, but a lot of research, including some by my doctoral students, has shown that by and large companies aren't that anxious to share their ideas, that there's a great deal of emphasis on confidentiality, but then in order to have negotiations, you have to have a lot of people present, and it's convenient to have all these people in the same place. So it's also important that these cities have an infrastructure, particularly of airports, that allows people to come together. So perhaps the most important aspect of global cities, and here again this probably applies to Singapore, is the existence of pools of very highly skilled labor, so that firms that need to recruit have available to them the kinds of personnel they need, but also one sees a lot of hiving off, so that financial firms will often divide up and give birth to boutique financial firms, for example, or architects will break away from the partnerships they're in and start new ones, so that you have a combination of factors that produces this pool of very highly skilled labor within global cities. So in these two respects of the clustering of business and financial services and of a highly skilled labor pool, I think we could call Singapore a global city. But there's certain other aspects of global citydom which perhaps are not here. One of being a dominant location for the production of global culture. We can think of Hollywood, we can think of Mumbai, of London and Paris as places which are enormously influential in terms of the culture of the world. But I don't think that we could really say that that's the case for Singapore. Another of my PhD students wrote a book about the way in which arts, fashion, culture also form usually a complex in global cities, that here the size of the market allows them to purvey their wares. The existence of a big tourism economy means that there are a lot of buyers for what they sell. So that this cluster contributes to both competitiveness and to amenities for local people. And here again, I think, although there have been efforts lately in Singapore to enhance its role as a cultural center, that they still are rather limited, and even in relationship to a number of Asian cities like Shanghai or Hong Kong, it's quite limited. Global cities are characterized as well by diversity, and Singapore, of course, has a very diverse population in terms of ethnicity, but they're also characterized by diversity in terms of opinion, and there we might raise some issues which perhaps Norman will address, or Kenneth maybe will address, in relationship to Singapore. Now, what has been identified in terms of the greatest deficiency or demerit or lack of benefit, perhaps, of global cities is that where you have geographical clusters of industries with global ties, that it creates, on the one hand, a stratum of very high earners, but on the other hand, it tends also to create a stratum of very low earners. That the spending patterns and particularly the space demands of the high earners affect retail and housing markets, so that housing is very expensive in global cities, and that there's a lot of high-end retail as well, that working spaces are specialized and very expensive, and that all of this skews the property market, so that you have a much higher cost of living within global cities. And then within the labor force, on the one hand, you have this high-end labor pool of very specialized, very talented people, but on the other hand, you have a huge demand for not very highly productive personal services, for consumption services of various kinds, ranging from manicurists to nannies to maids, and that these people tend to be very low paid. Now, this is an outcome of global cityness, not a cause of it. So that in order to create a global city, you don't want to say, well, we're just going to produce a very skewed income distribution. But if you don't have policy that in some way counters that, then you have essentially a great deal of inequality, a lot of lack of equity. Now, I started out by saying that the terms global city and competitive city are not synonymous. There is a concern in Singapore, I know, that if there's too much redistribution, if there's too much of a commitment to greater equity, that this will reduce growth. There's also a concern that Singapore as a city-state is limited in its capabilities. However, I would argue that there are great advantages to being a city-state. They far outweigh the disadvantages. If you take a look at New York City right now, which has a new mayor who's who's committed to greater equity, well, he finds that he has to go to the New York State legislature to do almost anything. He cannot raise taxes without the permission of the state legislature. And so what you find in countries which have major cities is there tends to be a conservative element in the countryside which opposes people within the cities who want to have greater redistribution. And in particular in developing countries, there tends to be a rural landowning class, which is a very conservative element within the country. Singapore, on the other hand, has control over immigration, control over its own revenues, control over its own expenditures, which virtually any mayor of almost any other city would give their right and left arms in order to get. So I've just briefly sketched out what I mean by a global city, that a competitive city has perhaps certain aspects of being a global city, but not necessarily all of them. A just city is characterized by what in my book called the just city. I said that there were three principles that define a just city. And by this I don't mean a good city, which incorporates more, but a just city is one that has democracy, diversity, and equity. So what are the elements that would then make up these three principles? One is public participation. And public participation means more than just surveying people and saying how many people are in favor of this or getting miscellaneous comments, but it actually involves participation through channels that are involved in what's called often civil society, that is, organized interests that are able to make their views known. It also involves, in terms of diversity, mixed neighborhoods. Now, Singapore has been, of course, very committed, and Norman will talk about this more, to the ethnic integration policy and to having HDB housing throughout the city. Diversity also means tolerance of the other. And I think that this is, in general, characteristic of Singapore. Public housing is an aspect of having greater equity that inevitably, in every city that has existed historically, that housing for low-income people requires a subsidy. There is no way that markets produce low-income housing except with very high levels of crowding. So we saw in the 19th century in Europe and in the United States so-called tenement reform, which was an effort largely to use housing codes to limit the amount of housing and to require better sanitation in places where low-income people lived. But the problem with that is once you enforce rules, then it becomes much more expensive to provide the housing, and the earnings that poor people get are insufficient to support decent housing. So it's only with a public subsidy that we can have adequate housing for the whole population. So public housing and then also inexpensive transportation, these are the two elements which really depend on a public involvement, a governmental involvement, in order to produce a more equitable city. The question for Singapore, and this is where I'm going to stop talking, is whether it can have both, whether it can have both competitiveness and the principles of a just city, democracy, diversity, and equity.
Thanks, Susan. So we're really talking about a competitive city. We're not really talking about global cities as that concept has been so fully developed in the literature. So we keep an eye on the competitive aspect of the global city. I wanted to ask you, and this is probably a question that you're asked very often, but I think it's still worth asking just so that we can be very clear about why we're thinking about justice in these particular ways. So I think it's probably difficult to argue against your choice of equity, participation or democratic participation and diversity as being essential features of your vision of urban justice. And you say this is about justice and not a good state, right? But why would you not include in this autonomy or self-development or freedom from exploitation, freedom from domination? Why would you not include sustainability, or since we're here, livability, security, human security, all these kinds of things as alongside these three things that you've picked as central to urban justice?
Well, I think if you're talking about a good city, you would. And David Harvey, the geographer, uses the term the city of heart's desire. Henri Lefebvre is often cited in terms of what he calls the right to the city, which means more than a just city. It means the ability of people within a city to both shape their own selves and to shape the city. And I think those things are all important, and I agree that a full philosophy of the city would say what is a good city. Right now, actually, the Social Science Research Council in the United States is starting a series of forums on what are the elements of a decent city is the terminology they actually use, and I'm participating in one of these in a couple of months. But I just didn't go that far. And the reason that I so emphasized justice and the context in which I was coming from was we have seen in the world in the last 20 years or so, well, really since the middle 1970s, so we're talking now more than 30 years, the tide of what's been called neoliberalism. That is a view that what every place needs to do is foster the market, foster competition, and somehow everybody will benefit and it will somehow trickle down. But in fact, it hasn't trickled down, and that we have seen greater and greater inequality in the world. Sasson goes further and argues that we've seen greater polarization, that is that the middle has disappeared and that there are more people at the top and more people at the bottom, and that's a more controversial statement, but nobody doubts that inequality has grown enormously and that we have more and more inequity. And so the question becomes, how do you counter that? And in particular, when I've been in different kinds of planning organizations, the question has always been, well, what policies do we need to do to make for greater growth? And so I want to see that conversation change, and that the conversation around planning should be much more what policies would create more just outcomes rather than more competition, greater growth.
Can I just pick up on that your last sentence, which is you'd like to see the discourse change. So I guess my question is about how you see yourself as a scholar activist. Changing the discourse is one way that this can happen, the way people think and the way people act and the way people assess and prescribe. How do you see theory effecting transformations and change beyond sort of the scholarly realm? And this is a very important question for us as scholars and think tanks and centers and all of that. What sort of change can we actually expect in the theorization that we do?
Well, I guess I would say that I'm better as a scholar than I am as an activist, and so I try to do what I do best. But I've spoken in lots of different places. This would be an example. I mean, this is not a university. Many people are here from different milieus. I've spoken to the planning associations in the United States, to quite a few of them, both local and national, I think through public lectures and public conversations that there are a lot of people actually who are policymakers who feel kind of cowed by this constant pressure to say what will produce growth, and that even presenting a counter discourse and saying, well, there are other people who think like you do, and that's important, and it doesn't mean that you're soft in the head because you say, well, but is that a just outcome? So I think that's the most that somebody like me can do, but there are a lot of people out there who are advocates, who work for community groups, who work within bureaucracies, who can, in fact, change the discourse, and particularly can do so if they feel that it isn't being too bizarre to say something besides, we got to figure out what would make us more competitive.
Okay, so these are strategies that we can achieve within our scholarly realm, for instance. What about your view about neoliberalism itself? It's obviously entrenched in the system. It's probably the enemy, if you want to put it that way. And competitiveness is a particular aspect of it that we might want to problematize or bring to the attention of policymakers: efficiency, growth, these kinds of questions. How strongly hegemonic is neoliberalism today? Do you see signs of it weakening or kind of crumbling for reasons other than scholarly intervention?
Well, the global financial crisis of 2007-8 seemed to discredit it. Because it definitely did show that the markets don't always get the prices right. In fact, it got the prices very wrong. But somehow that it hasn't gone away, even though you might have thought it would. Now, Asia is somewhat different because Asia has had this tradition of state-led economic development, which continues despite the efforts to discredit it. Although even the Asian developmental states have certainly moved more in the neoliberalist direction. It's interesting that, in fact, economists of the people within universities have been so triumphant, and they have these locutions. They say these things like, "You can't distort prices." Well, I mean, what is it about the price that's created by supply and demand when in fact you have monopoly pricing that isn't distorted to begin with? Or what would be the right price that we're distorting from? Or the term moral hazard. Now, to me, a moral hazard was always exploitation, but to them a moral hazard is simply somebody taking advantage and getting a rent. Now, and that would mean people, for example, getting health benefits that they didn't pay for. Now, I would say that getting health benefits is not a moral hazard, it's a moral benefit. But these sayings have somehow become just embedded and used again and again. There was an op-ed in the New York Times by a person who was, I guess you'd say, a colleague of mine at Harvard, although I certainly never met him. He had been head of George W. Bush's Council of Economic Advisors, and he recently wrote a piece indicating that inequality was really a good thing because we really needed, in order to have competitive places and the growing world economy, we had to have recruitment at the top of the most talented people, and for some reason the most talented people seem unwilling to accept a salary of a mere $1 million or $2 million a year, but you really had to have 30 million or 50 million or whatever they're getting these days, some of these executives. And he said, of course, some people question whether people, then he mentioned, as everybody does, of course, Steve Jobs. But then he said, well, of course, people in the financial industry aren't quite producing new, innovative things. But then he says, without the financial industry, the world wouldn't turn, or we need it. But that doesn't really show why people in the financial industry should be getting, as a result of essentially speculation, such enormous benefits. And so the reason we're seeing such a huge growth in inequality is because people at the top, and when I say the top, I mean 0.001%, are getting such an enormous proportion of the world's income. And to say that, well, we need incentives to merit, well, you don't need incentives of that size in order to have a reward to merit. And moreover, if you look at the list of the Forbes 500, about half of them are inheritors. It wasn't that they did anything for anybody. The Walton family, well, Sam Walton invented Walmart, and maybe we will consider that one of the great innovations of the 20th century. But his heirs together have a fortune that's something like, I can't remember what, but over $100 billion. Now, what did they do except be born to, in fact, to deserve this? And so then you have to say, well, you had to give him, Sam Walton, the incentive of being able to leave all this money to his progeny. But I think these are very, when you put them to the light, not very good arguments for having very high levels of inequality.
I'm going to ask Norman, actually. I mean, as a good American husband, I'm sure you agree with many of the things that Susan says. But there must be things that you differ slightly in the reading of the current situation, the formulation of the just city and all of that. What are some of the things that you have a different view on?
Are you planning to have me go home tonight?
Yep.
Actually, I was going to reinforce what Susan was just saying, then come back to the original question you asked her about neoliberalism and its health. Susan and I teach a course at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and we spent a day a couple of weeks ago looking at historical income data on the relationship between CEO salaries and worker salaries, and we looked comparatively too. And I remember something really vividly, that in 1960, when General Electric was one of the most successful companies in the world, the CEO had something like 60 times the salary of the median worker, the rest of the workforce. And today, the CEO has something like 400 times the salary of the median rest of the workforce. Now, it's extremely difficult for me to believe that CEO in 1960 was a less talented person than the present CEO. And so one of the things that makes you really want to stand up and shout when people say inequality is necessary for growth is just to say just how much, under what circumstances, when is inequality helpful, and when is it simply extraction, as we just saw on the pulling down the walls of the palace in Kiev, extraction. The other thing is we also look comparatively, and the ratios of CEO to worker, average worker salaries across EU countries dramatically varies from one to another. There's no relationship, in fact, between this and the growth rates of different countries. So we have to be very cautious throwing our lot in with neoliberal claims or neoclassical economic claims that everybody has their just desserts, because in this world, the just dessert of the person at the top is to get paid as much as possible, showing therefore the corporate competitiveness of the company, and to reduce the wages of every other worker, especially those at the bottom half, as low as possible to show the competitiveness of the country or the firm. So let's be resistant. And I know Susan was saying this already. I do think also that if you think about neoliberalism, it is being assaulted in more than one way. First of all, its crises have happened regularly and may continue to happen and may become more significant. And the crises are not going to always be expressed in terms of the bursting of bubbles. And there was a recent assault against Singapore saying it was a bubble economy, which I didn't agree with. The crises are going to be expressed politically in ways that seem to have nothing to do with neoliberal or economists and economics, but have a great deal to do with the response of people to environments of increasing inequality and of deprivation at the bottom. Very often these responses will be of a totally non-modern mode, which have to do not with out-arguing economists, but with saying that faith trumps reason. We've seen that in many parts of the world. It'll be expressed in nationalist modes with the help of leaders who can advance themselves doing that. So by itself, this produces a very unsustainable world economy. And that's what I would worry about in terms of neoliberalisms, if there's such a thing, permanent hegemony.
Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting point, and it kind of suggests that from extreme inequalities that are produced by neoliberalism and the stake that the winners have in sustaining the myth of competitiveness, the response to that is what you say, what you describe as a kind of pre-modern, would you say kind of extra-constitutional, outside of the democratic process, anti-modern. So in that sense, it's en route to fascism of some kind, right? That's what you're pointing to, a populism that slips into fascism.
We've certainly seen in a number of countries, anybody who's been watching Russia and Ukraine lately can certainly see, and some countries around here with a different set of ideas, connections that integrate basically a nationalism and a very aggressive behavior towards difference, saying we have to reestablish the folk, whatever the term is going to be, with also pure connection with global capitalism. And we've seen that model throughout the 20th century, heaven help us, and many people in Singapore lost their lives fighting that model in its variants, Asian and European variants. And yes, it can happen again. Capitalism, when its ills are not taken care of, capitalism is a wonderful system, but it creates illnesses of various kinds. And when those are not taken care of, the patient often dies.
Mm-hmm. So are we able to think of the theory of the just city or urban justice as a means of correcting for this type of dynamic? Is that one way of thinking about the power of the theory?
I think it is, and that people will often in question periods say, well, if we have equality, how will we ever have incentives? Well, it isn't a question. We're not going to get equality. We're only going to get less inequality. And so to take the extreme case of a totally, in terms of diversity, a totally heterogeneous population, or in terms of democracy, everybody having their say all the time, or having perfect equality, we're not talking about reaching that. We're simply really talking about a more just city rather than a less just city, and that what we've seen in the last 30 or so years is a move in many parts of the world towards greater and greater injustice within cities. The enormity of slum housing, not in Singapore. I mean, Singapore, one of its great achievements was the elimination of slums. But that there's certain, and Norman's going to talk more directly about Singapore, but there's certain now instabilities in Singapore as a result, perhaps, of its successes, and that other kinds of issues, once everybody is housed, other kinds of issues need to be addressed. The Pioneer Package, of course, was a response to saying, well, there is too much inequality in Singapore and we need to do something about it, and this was a rather clever way of addressing it. But I think what one has to say is that you have to counter this constant drive to say all that really matters is growth, and that in order to get growth, what we have to do is let the market do its work. But instead, you have to focus on those people who aren't ever going to benefit from letting the market do its work. And you also have to realize that the market is never like the perfect ideal of the neoclassical economists who see perfect competition and that nobody dominates the market, or who see, if CEOs are getting $70 million a year, it must be because they deserve it and there couldn't be anybody else who could do that job. Well, that's, on the face of it, silly. And that within cities you do see classes of people who either are unemployed or detached from the workplace, what the Europeans call the socially excluded, but you see an awful lot of really low-wage earners. And so the question is, how do you address people whose earnings are simply not sufficient to have an adequate standard of living? And that a more just city would focus on those people, not simply on growth.
Okay, I'm going to now invite some questions from the floor, but please let me request that you reserve questions that are very specific to Singapore for the second segment. So if anyone has questions, please. So do introduce yourselves. I think there are mics along the aisles.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah. Prof, thank you very much. My name is Ais. I'm just a lay person, sir. Well, thank you very much for the partnership. Good to know. I'm sorry, my apology, profound apology for being a bit late. Now, I think that when our kind moderator wanting to engage with Prof. Susan with regard to the issues of justice, I think it's quite not that often you find a moderator in Singapore wanting to do that. Now, my point here is that, yes, coming back to the HDB when you are highlighting the HDB, but then your point is very much from a distance rather than Singaporean who are living here. And to date, I have not heard one Singaporean would say, why do the HDB have to remain instilled upon corporate arbitration instead of public arbitration in the contract with the public? I couldn't believe it until now. So that is quite, over the years, as though that we have not grown up. So you see the question is that, of course, we're not going to talk about the issues of monopoly because you don't like it. I would rather say, coming back to the point of the global city, I just came back from the UAE, and all the transportation, everything seems to be satellite driven, and the ICT is working. Ours, we have gentry point everywhere. Parking, we still got to use coupon and kind of thing, and not mobile ICT, enabled. I couldn't quite understand what are we to be. So, and you say that there are too many things more to cover. Why are we not moving into 21C? We're still in 20C environment.
Thank you. Okay, so that wasn't a question.
Right, that's my question.
Okay. Oh, is it?
Yeah. So I'm wondering that, are we Singaporean here is unable to think what's right for us?
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
All right, maybe we take a couple of others.
I'm going to defer on that. Yeah. No, because The second half of the program will be about Singapore.
Yeah.
Right.
And so I'm here just as the theorist on Sirma's perspective.
She doesn't know Singaporeans can think.
We'll come back to these Singapore issues and the broader question that you're asking. Yes, sir. Hi, JD.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm JJ. I'm working in the Lee Kuan Yew Center for Innovative Cities, SUTD, and I did my PhD in the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. I wanted to pick up on the issue of the embedding of neoliberal values and norms. And in Asia, we find that the state is increasingly a market participant through state-owned enterprises, sovereign wealth funds, and also the private sector is increasingly becoming a public sector actor through the new public management movement. In such a situation, would you say that the state itself has been co-opted into the hegemonic forces of neoliberal thought? And if so, who is going to produce a more just city, if not the state, nor the markets? Thank you.
I think that's a brilliant question, and I'm not really at all sure of the answer. That certainly the developments in Asia of leadership by the state and the extent of sovereign wealth funds and the involvement of the state as a corporate actor distinguishes the Asian states from European states and most certainly from the United States. But whether you would say that these state agencies act as if they're private capitalist firms or not, I think varies from country to country. And the extent to which they actually turn over their proceeds, their revenues, to the public sector for redistributive purposes varies substantially as well. I haven't the slightest idea what the Emirates, which have huge sovereign wealth funds, do with the money, but it seems largely to be to make the living conditions of the sultans better. But in East Asia, it varies substantially in terms of how much of it's turned over. So I guess I would say that there certainly is behavior within the public sector that's entrepreneurial, and whether or not the benefits from it circulate outside of the public sector or outside of the personnel in the public sector is something that you can only find out through research, and the research is very hard because everybody keeps these numbers as hidden as possible. There's very little that's transparent about these funds, including here, we've discovered. So I really don't know the answer, but I see your worry, and I think it really is an issue. When I first started teaching planning, people saw planning as a very technocratic field, and that planners tended to be sort of passive and non-political and non-entrepreneurial. And it was a revolution in planning thought that planners, in order to get things done, needed to be entrepreneurial. So being entrepreneurial in itself within government and following certain concepts from new public management is not inherently a bad thing, but it's a question really of, okay, does that then mean that you overwhelm whatever citizens might want, and does it mean that the revenues that arise from this are in fact returned to the public or are not returned to the public is really, I think, from the point of view of justice, the critical issue.
I will add one slight thing. One slight thing, and I do agree completely with Susan. I actually, in talking about Singapore, outside of Singapore, point out the remarkable fact that the nation, through its sovereign wealth funds and various corporations that are somewhat more distant, actually is a major player in the private capitalist in the global world, and that revenues come back to the people in the form of profits, and then various ways they're described from these funds. It's very difficult to know exactly the balance in each case without having the numbers, but I think you can't answer the question formally. It has to be answered substantively. It's like, and I thought the analogy is, look, every military is alike. They all have pretty similar kinds of ranks and military cultures, and yet every military is really different in the culture of the senior officer corps, its feelings, its relationship to civilian leadership, its relationship to the popular mass of to the people, citizens of a country, and it is quite possible to have deep involvement in the military or in sovereign wealth funds and PSAs of the world, and yet not be quite the same in your behavior as people who are in similarly organizations that look similar. So co-optation is not inevitable, or it doesn't have to be total. Everything is a matter of degree.
I think, yes.
Hi, my name is Bai and I write for ecobusiness.com. You mentioned the economic and political crises of neoliberalism and capitalism, and I think these processes have also taken a huge toll on the environment and our natural resources. We see it all around us in terms of climate change and resource scarcity. So what role, in your opinion, does sustainability have in shaping a more just city? Thanks.
Yeah, well, clearly I should have talked more about sustainability in my book, and probably in terms of the elements of urban justice. It's a very difficult political issue in that sustainability and environmentalism are often used as, you might say, covers for even greater exploitation or exclusion. Often, now there's this big move in terms of what's called resilience, to return certain areas to wetlands. And unsurprisingly, it turns out that the areas which are the ones most amenable to being returned to wilderness are ones where poor people live. Both because poor people tended to live in the most environmentally undesirable areas, but also because that's the land that's the cheapest. Or in American suburban communities, it isn't that they oppose low-income housing in their midst. It's that raising densities would be so bad for the environment. So environmentalism is often used as a way of creating greater injustice. On the other hand, there's the environmental justice movement, which says that it in fact is low-income people or people who are ethnically different who bear the brunt of obnoxious facilities and of pollution, who are the ones who have the highest rates of asthma and other pollution-caused diseases. So I think sustainability is critically important, of course, but one has to always be careful when you're talking about it, to talk about it within a context of what do you mean by sustainability in terms of its impact on different groups within the population. I guess the reason that I haven't spent my time on it is that it would have required both a lot more expertise in the area of environmental science than I've got, and that in the scholarly division of labor, I've kind of left it for someone else. It's really hard enough, I guess I would say, to try to be interdisciplinary and to be concerned with issues of justice across both economic groups and different racial and ethnic groups, and to look at cities as areas of social and economic and political interaction, and then also to be concerned with environmental issues. So I just, in defense of my approach, say that most people, in fact, don't even get that broad.
That's true, but we can at least say that we need to be mindful of the possibility of things like sustainability and resilience serving as neoliberal smoke screens, if anything else. Yeah? I saw two more hands, and maybe we can just have these two questions before we move on to the next segment.
Hi, my name's Evan. So thanks for that. I just wanted to, you did mention at the start that the name of this panel didn't actually have to be a dichotomy. So I want to explore that a bit further. That notion of the just city and the competitive city. I feel that, is there a way that you could explain how you could be just and competitive at the same time? And to anchor it in the example of Singapore, I feel that competitiveness is necessary for our very existence. We're a small place, no natural resources, we depend upon people. If we don't have competitiveness, we can't exist. I would borrow from a Marxist line of thinking, which says, in order for equality to exist, the conditions had to be right. And those conditions were economic. Without the economic conditions, you can't have justice, you can't have equality. There won't be any goods to distribute, the wealth to share around. So how would you reconcile justice and competitiveness so they can both coexist?
Thank you. Can we take another one here?
Hi, I'm Lim Tong Kay from Skyrise Communities. My question actually leads to the title of today's talk. It says Singapore's dilemma as a city-state. I would rather focus on Singapore's characteristic as a city-state and how we are different from other global cities. Because I think we are very different and we can compete differently. So I think this is a very interesting topic to look at.
Okay.
And how we can actually achieve, I think basically that's what it is. I think it should be focused on what we are and how we're different and how we can compete and how we in fact can be a global city in a different way.
Okay, so the uniqueness of Singapore.
Yeah.
And then maybe one more if you don't mind.
My name is T.H. Chien. I'm from the private sectors. Can I ask you a bit on the social aspect of global city? Now, we used to watch a lot of the American movies, and it always shows the demise of global city. Things like Robocops and all that, it's very frightening. So can you share with us how, for us to look at the American Hollywood movie regarding the cities and the future trends?
Okay, well, first, can we reconcile justice and competitiveness? Yes, I don't see it as an insuperable problem. It means that you have to pay constant attention to those people who are getting negative benefits from competitiveness. In the case of Singapore, this is, of course, especially the foreign workers. And Singapore's competitive advantage is that it offers all the amenities of a very advanced city and the cheap labor of a non-advanced city. There's leeway there. There's leeway in terms of how people who provide labor are treated. That you don't have to say, oh, well, we have to give up altogether on being competitive if in fact we are decent to our maids, for example. There was a piece in the Straits Times today about how a group of Indonesian maids all are going home because they couldn't get any days off. Well, you're not going to really become less competitive because you give your maids a day off, for sure. And there are a number of, the ways in which the cheapest labor are treated can be changed without really lowering Singapore's global competitiveness. There's much that can be done if, in fact, you focus on doing it. To go back to what I said earlier, we don't need to have perfect equality or perfect equity or perfect diversity. We can simply have less inequality and less intolerance and less coercion without going all the way. In terms of Singapore as being a city-state, this has been raised to us in a number of conversations we've had here, that somehow that creates problems for Singapore that other cities don't have. But I just find it difficult to quite see that as a major problem because it does give you, on the one hand, so much more autonomy. If you take, say, New York, the fact that it's part of the richest country on earth is certainly helping it in lots of ways. but it also being part of a country where there's so much political opposition to the kinds of policies that New York's governing bodies would like to follow, makes it much more difficult. Even if you go back to Mayor Bloomberg, whose policies I have various criticisms of, but he was a leader in gun control, in fact. And now the rest of the world looks at the United States and the fact that there's such a strong lobby for carrying guns and thinks that that's really bizarre. But there are an awful lot of Americans who believe in it religiously. And so it means that for New York City, controlling the flow of guns into the city that comes from other states where there's very little in the way of regulation, they can't do much about it. So the fact that you're an island nation gives you enormous amounts of power over what goes on in Singapore, which it's hard to think of any exactly comparable place. Hong Kong would maybe be the most comparable in certain ways, but China, of course, has so much say over what goes on in Hong Kong. One could compare it to Switzerland or Israel, bigger than Singapore, but in fact, small states which also rely entirely on entrepreneurship and having export economies in order to do as well as they do, because they really have very little in the way of natural resources. On the other hand, you have states like the Emirates, which, because they have so much oil, in fact, aren't entrepreneurial and aren't really competitive in any kind of way. So I don't think your fate is determined by the fact that you're a city-state. In terms of the last question of the social aspect of a global city, well, one of the characteristics of global cities is that they do have substantial diversity in terms of the backgrounds, the ethnic backgrounds of their populations, in terms of having a lot of immigration. When Saskia Sassen wrote her book, she identified New York, London, and Tokyo as the three preeminent global cities. I think Tokyo would now probably drop out of the triad, and in part that's because Japan has been so opposed to immigration. So that you can see that other cities, which are in fact more diverse, have turned out to be more innovative than Tokyo. Richard Florida, who has been very influential in policy-making circles and whom one can find a good deal about his arguments that are kind of weak, but he really stresses that what creates innovative cities and competitive cities is a high level of activity and diversity, and that in terms of the social life of global cities, I think what you see in them is, in fact, a very high level of literally activity in the streets, of people tolerating people who are different, of a kind of liveliness that makes them places that people want to be in.
So I think what we'd like to do now is to move on to the second part of this panel discussion. And as we said earlier, this will be specifically on Singapore. And I invite Norman to start us off.
All right. And I don't know if I should fasten my seatbelt or you should. We're foreigners and occasional observers of Singapore. This has been our fourth visit to Singapore, each time for 2 or 3 months, and we've done some research, and of course we're doing a lot of teaching here. So take what I say with the grain of salt, the virtues and liabilities of somebody from abroad who's very sympathetic to Singapore, but raising issues about how Singapore can, I think, become a more just and a more successful, even more successful city. And I'm going to just talk briefly about 4 things that are related. And you've all talked about all these things in one way or other. So this will be familiar to you, but it's simply to reinforce some discussions in Singapore that I think need to continue and become perhaps a little more vocal. HDB is, of course, one of the most extraordinary inventions in all of social policy around the entire world. There is nothing equivalent to HDB not just in its scale and its quality, but in its financing method, in the creation of a secondary market, in a whole series of elements that I will not go into. But one of the things we've also seen, and in part this was an accidental invention, a purposeful invention, a combination, and HDB has changed policies at various times as well. One of the things that's most notable to an outside observer, though, is the extent to which HDB housing stands as a substitute for elements, and I will avoid using the word welfare state because I know that's not very popular idea in Singapore, but let's just say elements of public policy or public social policy, which elsewhere have a long history, often a very conservative history. It was Otto von Bismarck who created the first retirement plan for workers, so it was not Karl Marx. And so the dependence of using HDB housing for a whole number, substituting for a whole number of programs that have not been fully developed in Singapore, I think becomes a more and more serious issue. And as Susan mentioned, I think the response of creating a series of targeted programs for people over 65 who happen to be members of the pioneer generation is a brilliant way of opening the conversation that we have to do a number of other kinds of things, that we can't simply expect housing appreciation, capital appreciation in housing, or even the component of the CPF that's now been established to be sufficient to meet the demographic needs of this elderly population, which will be growing substantially in size and probably in its demand structure as well. So one set of areas has to do with replacing HDB and placing less burden on it to keep having capital appreciation and other kinds of things, because it's substituting for targeted programs which would be much more rational and efficient than simply the capital appreciation of your HDB flat being the basis for, and family support being the whole basis for your retirement. The other, there's more we could talk about, but the other element that's obvious about HDB also is the way it's used as a lever to create social policy. Not just a substitute, but a lever to create social policy that elsewhere would be much discussed and would be carried out through separate programs. The formation of families, the having of children is not part of the purview of the state even in very dominant welfare states, or it's carried out through explicit programs outside of housing. The contradictions that start to develop as you try to leverage so many different elements of social policy with the single vehicle of housing become more and more serious, and Singapore is facing this problem right now and has to move beyond it with creative thought. An example, I think, is the family formation, exhorting the very women that you have told should go to university, should go get A-star bourses and go to LSE or something for their postgraduate work. You're also asking to have children, get married young, have children young, more than 2, hopefully, because we'll give you a subsidy if you have 3. And as you know, the birth rate is way, way down among Singapore citizens. And we're not going to let you, unless you get married, move into HDB housing. If you're a single professional and you're under the age of 34, forget about it. You have to be someplace else. Well, someplace else will often be London or New York, and people will not come back. So one of the things that one has to think about are the trade-offs in very desirable, laudable goals of human capital formation and of family coherence, and the difficulty of putting all this burden on the managers of public housing, a fabulous program in its own right. So that's one. The second issue that I would raise, and Susan alluded to it several times, and it's certainly not something that any of you will be surprised about, is the fact that there is very little long-term planning for short-term workers. And it was one thing perhaps in 1990 when there was something like 312,000 foreign workers in all of Singapore with E-Pass to W-Pass. Everybody. There was 300 something, a little over 300,000. And now we're talking about 1.5 million at least as of a year ago. And about 1 million of those foreign workers are W-Pass holders. And it is too much to say, oh, they're all construction workers working on site, or they are all people living in households as maids, because we know this is not true. We know that of the construction workers, people who are construction workers, only a few 100,000 are actually the kind that are putting up big buildings and living on site in dormitories. We know there are only 200,000 maids. Even right now with these demographics, we have about 500,000 people you might say are unaccounted for. We know there are 40,000 HDB flats that are sublet to foreign workers. We know there's a market in privately owned flats. Obviously, people are not sleeping on the street and they're not sleeping in the park, but most of these workers are not being planned for. They're certainly not being well planned for. And to fall back and say, well, people are only workers for 2 years. First of all, many are workers for more than 2 years. They're only here for 2 years. They're only here for a few years. Maybe this will go away because we'll increase efficiency in SMEs. These are all unrealistic, I think, responses. Because, in fact, the demographics of the society are such there's going to be more and more demand for low-end foreign workers who can basically take care of you and your parents as you get older. And we'll leave out other demands in the tourism sector and so on. These are jobs that cannot be made more efficient. They cannot be replaced by machines. When you go to a resort or when you have yourself home care, the better the care means the more people, more person hours taking care of you. So what I'm saying is that we need realistic planning, not for the present population, but for one, maybe another million larger. And this, I think, was exactly what the population white paper said very, very clearly. The poor authors of it were basically hoisted on the petard of 6.9 million, instead of some of the other lessons in the white paper that were intended to raise a rational conversation in Singapore. So that's the second element. What exactly do we have in mind for foreign workers, and how can we live with foreign workers? How can you, as Singaporeans, live with foreign workers getting paid $300 or $400 a week? How do you live a month? How do you live knowing that the well-being of so much of Singaporean society depends upon this? Yes, I know people are here rationally and individually and made choices because they came from countries where they couldn't even get $400 a month, where they can now send remittances back home. Of course, you're part of a South Asian and Southeast Asian global system of poverty that permits Singapore to do certain things. But in a city that becomes more and more just, you don't just do what you're permitted to do. And it's not just a question of X or Y. It's not a question of we cannot possibly pay foreign workers any more money or we would become much less competitive. There's the questions of degree and profit and profitability that are pretty easy to see where there might be trade-offs. And as Susan said, it's hard to believe the competitiveness of the Singapore economy depended upon a foreign maid having no days off a month. That's very hard to believe. Okay, the third, and this is something that we were just down on the URA gallery looking once again at models from the master plan, and particularly interested in the area that's known as Marina South, which there's a wonderful video down there of renderings by animators and architects, planners about what a lively district this is going to be. And I hope it will be, and it should be. But the one thing that's noticeable about Marina South, and which is a more general phenomena in the central area, has been the lack of construction, with the one exception of Pinnacle at Duxton, of HDB housing. And there were decisions made in the mid-'80s to no longer build HDB housing in the core CBD of the city. I can't go, I don't even know for sure how to explain Pinnacle. But one of the things that it raises is, and this is the other side of the inequality equation, is the dangers to, I'd say, not just to being a just city, but to being a stable city, and a stable city with a happy and integrated citizenry. The dangers of more and more islands of the upper class, whether they're called gated communities or not called gated communities, they amount to the same thing. If you take several hectare of 100 hectare of land and you build housing that only the top 2 or 3% of the island's residents can afford, you're not going to create an environment which is going to be lively with ordinary people, because they won't feel like going there. The message will be clear. And a very nice piece was just published by Insights from the Center for Livable Cities, making a whole series of arguments about why it is important to continue making investments of public housing and maybe of new forms of public-private housing in the central business district. And I know you can all get this readily, and it articulates the position much better than I would here. And the last thing I wanted to raise, and in some ways this is to push the most difficult button. There's I make references to horrible movies that my wife has never seen, but there's one called Men in Black I've watched 10 times, and probably every man in here. I mean, I don't know, women may watch this too, about men who are in the business of a secret police force to fight aliens from outer space, and they dress in black suits, better tailored than this. And there's a line in there that says, "Don't touch the button, don't touch the button." It's in his supercar, and the guy touches the button and the car flies upside down through tunnels and all kinds of things. So the button is ethnicity in Singapore, and the EIP in particular. And one of the things that I, as a foreigner, and we travel around quite a bit, I always become nervous in places where ethnicity and religion are stamped on national identity cards. Because as a student of race and ethnicity for many decades, one of the things that I begin to think is, as soon as you do that, you reify, you turn into stone, or you make essential something, an identity that was contingent. An identity that was contingent on a time and place originally, but maybe makes much less sense in the third generation of people who are now stamped with that identity. Maybe begins to make less sense when you have a lot of intermarriage and go through contortions of what the identity of the new couple will be, much less of their rights to HDB resale housing or new housing. Maybe there's a time to start to rethink what the balance should be between not just tolerating, but respecting ethnic and religious differences and creating a unified Singapore citizenry. And that if you think ahead to the next 50th anniversary, that is the 100th anniversary, what do we imagine we would want Singapore to look like and Singaporeans to feel like, who are the very new permanent residents of today, who have come with accents and with identities? What do we want them to feel like? What do we want their grandchildren to feel like, who are university graduates? How do we want them to identify? So that's the last of the difficult questions, and I think this is a question that also is going to have to be addressed as Singapore stays more and more committed to being not just competitive, perhaps global, but just. Thank you.
Thanks. A lot of things, a lot of difficult things. Maybe I'll just pick. I will not answer them, but I'll ask you to elaborate on this one first. So you talked about the HDB and its what it's doing, and you suggest, I think, that it's doing in some respects too much, when it comes to being overburdened with all kinds of policy objectives other than the original housing purpose, but also that it is over-interventionist in many ways, because there's certain outcomes and values that are fed through the system. But you also say that it's not doing enough where, say, the needs and well-being of the migrant class is concerned. And so it kind of reminded me immediately of the theory again, equity, but also participation, democratic participation. One of the reasons, I guess, that foreign workers or migrant workers are underserved, if you like, is because their voice doesn't carry into the system. So when we talk about a just city and democratic participation, we can't be talking about citizens alone, right? How do you see that?
You know that there are actually all kinds of ways of packaging and unpackaging citizenship. And citizenship, like property, like private ownership, is a bundle of rights and obligations. And it's possible to create systems in which rights and obligations are not the same for different individuals. So, number one, I think the premise of your question is exactly right, that very rarely, as much as we want to do good when we're in leadership positions, and I've been in some of those positions, we tend to respond also to voice, you might say. And hopefully it's not just the loudest voice or the most recent voice or the most recent incident, but a discourse among leaders that's going to include the needs of groups that are presently voiceless is not terribly likely going to go that far. Because even if the leadership is well-meaning, and I think it is in Singapore, as soon as leaders start to propose things, and we've seen this a number of times in the last 20 years with regard to housing, for example, there'll be populist opposition, not in my neighborhood, not in my building, and so on. So unless there is some way to create public discourse, which includes the voice and voices of the 1.5 million people who live on this island who are not residents right now, I think the progress will only move to a certain point. You know, the terrible thing is, I know what the next incident is going to be that's going to produce a committee on inquiry and major reform. It's going to, I don't know when it will happen, but it will be, in fact, an illegally partitioned flat that housed 14 foreign workers in which there was a fire and 4 of them died. Because I look around the whole world, and I see this all the time. We've seen this so many times in New York. Or it's going to be in a workshop that never met code. The employer promised a lot of things, but the employer wasn't that well off themselves, and there was a fire and workers died. Well, and we see that actually in the construction sites. It's been sort of contained, but we see this actually every week now, or accidents of those open trucks where not only are there no seat belts, there are no seats for foreign workers. But that's not the way one wants to see Singapore go. So the answer is, and this is the most easiest thing for a foreigner to recommend, and I want to be on Shanyi and the runway when it goes public, is that there also has to be not only betterment for foreign workers, there has to, you can come with me, there has to be some kind of movement towards voice, towards representation. And it is possible that you can have better representation. There are 2 advocacy organizations that can do better than that, even if it's top-down, organized by MOM and other kinds of government agencies, even if it's not civil society from the bottom up and where you don't have to register to be a member of an organization. Still, movement in that direction would actually be healthy. Now, it would produce a little more conflict in public space, in public discourse, and I think Singapore is solid enough and mature enough to be able to take it.
No, I agree completely that democracy is part of justice, and to say, well, we have I think you'd say probably here, a guided democracy, but it only includes citizens when 1/3 of the population is not entitled to any rights of citizenship, is to say that you really are not a democratic or just society. There have been a lot of, in terms of other parts of the world, that of course there's always been an anti-colonial movement based on the premise that people who are colonized don't have representation. Well, you have a kind of internal colonialism here, and that it's only by providing representation to those people who have no political rights that you can say that this is a more genuine democracy as opposed to a democracy for the few. In the West, we look back at Athenian democracy, but of course Athens was only a democracy for an aristocratic class, and everybody else was a slave. Right, an aristocratic class of men, indeed. Right. So that it's crucial that there be some form of representation. Now, New York has an odd office called the Office of the Public Advocate, and that person supposedly brings complaints from the public. One could imagine an office that represents migrant workers and which publicizes their issues rather than being buried somewhere in the Ministry of Manpower.
Just wanted to also pick up on I guess a dimension of your point about the not mixed enough spaces in Singapore from the plans. And of course, one dimension of this is the zones that are, I guess, playgrounds for the super rich and all of that.
Where we live.
Where you live.
We're staying on Orange Tree Grove.
Yeah.
We have to admit, Orange Grove Road. Sorry.
Sorry, that was our fault.
It was LKY's fault. That's right. They forced us to stay there.
But what's the way to, and speaking as someone who doesn't know anything about these kinds of things, what do you do with the super rich? I mean, do you hide them away somewhere? And what do you do when it comes to? Do you mix them up?
All right, Kenneth. Number one, Singapore is doing great things with well-off people already. Look, while there are islands of expensive condos, and I'm worried about the formation of a new island in new URA areas that are being built up and platted for the first time. There's also an awful lot of condos mixed up in HDB areas. There are lots of models of very wealthy people who have no problem living near ordinary Singaporeans, in part because HDB occupants themselves go up to the 85th percentile in household income. That is because it's not a stigmatized population, and living near HDB is not stigmatizing. What's my model? My model, we were just eating dinner for quite a few upteenth time in Holland Village. Well, there's a place where we've got plenty of upmarket housing and plenty of HDB housing at the same time. And I notice an awful lot of condos they look great. They look like they're out in the middle of some island. But I know they're up at Punjol and in other places, Punggol, other places on the northeast coast area, north coast area, right near HDB housing. So there's plenty of stuff where well-off people can live in environments that are not completely contained. Another approach, and I know URA people are talking about this, is to make sure that because you're going to live in a gated building. Look, a high-rise building with a doorman is a gated community, but we don't have to put a gate around the terrain itself. There can be rights-of-way and paths, so when these buildings are in places that people would like to walk, they can walk near them. And so we don't permit quite this level I don't know. I would force everybody also who's very wealthy to take the MRT at least once a week, because even if we don't say they have to take them at take it at what's called rush hour here. Peak. At peak time, we'll make them take it at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, because the MRT is one of the most enjoyable subway underground systems in the entire world. For as a foreigner who's been in many, yes. And so this is a way to have much more democracy. One way to have it is, in fact, to actually make the value of car ownership even lower in certain parts of the city, certain times of the day, by prohibiting car ownership, making public transit, especially as new MRT lines are being constructed, the way that anybody who's even well off goes to the theater or something like that. We've actually seen that happen in New York, in which you now get on public transit at 11 o'clock at night, and you see in Manhattan, in the core, a tremendously heterogeneous clientele on public transit, because driving's so horrible. Now, Singapore has actually made driving easier for the super rich. We all know that. We know that the roads are rationed to lorries, taxi cabs, and the super rich, right? By the pricing of structure of cars. Conversely, Singapore has one of the very best mass transit systems in the world, and it's heavily subsidized. So this is a kind of deal with the devil that's been made here that does make life as a affluent person very easy if you like to drive, compared to any other place. People complain about traffic and so on. It's nothing. I would never get in a taxi cab in Manhattan at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a weekday, whereas I would here. That tells you right away, because you know, you don't know me, but I hate being in traffic jams.
Well, you stay in the Nassim Road area. Yeah, let's get a question, yeah.
Sorry, Raymond Kwok from Kwok Group LLP, Oxford Economy and VC.com. Norman and Susan, fantastic sharing. Can you share with us whether there is a checklist of items that must have? Basically, do we need to have a zoo? Do we need to have a museum? You know, at what stage in a global city? And the next one is a loaded question in a sense that size matter. The size matter in the sense Singapore is small. As we start growing, are we able to reclaim a little bit more land? Okay, to build a sort of a bigger global city compared to some other cities whereby you got no way to reclaim land. I mean, you know, and then you go into the forest. So maybe there are two questions here. The size matter, how does we look at a global city? And is there a checklist?
I think because we have so little time left, can we take a few questions and then we'll respond to all of them? Please. Yeah.
Thanks very much for that. I think it's quite enlightening what you just said. I think it's just hit me, actually, that justice can't be separated from identity politics, in the sense that the justice that we hope to attain, I think it's not so much, like you said, it's not so much about justice as minimizing injustice. And this minimizing of injustice probably stems from what we view as acceptable ways of life. So if a German man mentioned this to me, as though there's only one sanctioned way of pursuing happiness in Singapore. And I think if our identity is tied up with the accumulation of wealth, then there's always going to be this inherent tension. So I was wondering if you had specific recommendations or policies that could really talk about this, addressing injustice and changing the narrative away from wealth and growth into one that says human dignity and what it means to be human, sort of things.
Hi, I'm Vignesh. I'm a researcher at Lee Kuan Yew School. I wanted to go further on the issue of ethnic integration in Singapore. There's a good article today in Diplomat that talks about the ethnic policies in Singapore and how there are two different ethnic policies, one for the foreigner and one for the Singaporean. And even for the Singaporean, it does mention in the article, Michael Barr from Australia talks about how in Singapore we have this trade-off with the minorities willing to accept the fact that in Singapore, we'll always be treated as racial minorities, and in return, we get to live in this prosperous and safe country. how do we then tackle this issue of ethnic policy in Singapore? How do we go about having a conversation when the issue is so tightly controlled and managed within the society?
And just one more, please.
Susan, Norman, thank you for the presentation. I'd like to just quickly ask, I'm sorry, John Powers from the Lee Kuan Yew Center for Innovative Cities at SUTD, about the city-state notion and the issue of transformative change or just change on the margin. You seem to suggest that as a city-state, Singapore has all of these advantages. And yet, on some level, you also seem to suggest that all we can hope for is making the city less unequal. So to what extent might you equate the power of the city-state to being able to achieve change that is simply greater than just change on the margin and more transformative change towards justice? Thank you.
Who wants to go first? I'll do that first question. I have one.
Will you talk about size because you're the expert on density?
I'm short, so size matters. I know all about it. Love being out here in Singapore where I feel normal. One of the city-state size issue is a particularly interesting one because I went and looked at a lot of different cities on Google naturally, but these data are the kind that are pretty reliable. How many square kilometers is the city and what's its population and so on. And if we take the entire island, and I know there are military reservations and so on, but other places have things too. 715 square kilometers for 5.3 million people, density 7,500 persons per square kilometer. That includes immigrants this time, foreigners, everybody, 7,500. At the present, New York City has only about 785 square kilometers, so Singapore is almost as big as New York, but with much smaller population. New York has 8.4 million people, or 8.3 now, and a density of 11,000 people per square kilometer. 11,000 compared to Singapore's 7,500. Now, New York also has huge swaths that are marshland, that are airports, a very giant airport, bigger than Shanyivan, and whole sets of areas in parklands and reservoirs. So it's not so different at a higher density, a considerably higher density. And then the city that you all want to go to, well, I always want to go there for at least a few days, Paris. Inside the périphérique, that is the place that you'd go, any place within what you'd call the city of Paris and what is technically the political jurisdiction of Paris, the density is 20,000 people per square kilometer. 20,000 people, even though there's almost no high-rise in Paris except for a few horrors. So is Singapore terribly dense? I would say no. Now, people make arguments about there's no hinterland you can go to and so on, and sometimes those are convincing and sometimes they're not convincing to me. But compared to New York, say, a place which also has 2 million daily worker commuters on top of that resident population and only a few 100,000 who go out to work, we're talking about a place that, by world standards, is a dense, big city, but nothing special. And nothing special in terms of moving to 6.9 million, in fact, in which it would still be slightly less dense than New York is today. The other question that I'll take an easy question that I wanted to answer was about changing the discourse. Because I don't know how to talk about race in Singapore. But let's just say changing the discourse from pure economic competitiveness. We are changing the discourse. We're all here. And this is a discourse Susan and I are fortunate enough to be fellows at the Center for Livable Cities. Well, the word livable is already a tremendous step forward from just competitive, world, or even innovative. It means a lot of things. The question is, how can we extend the coverage, you might say, of the people for whom it should be livable to all of its population? That's the question. But the basis for a broader discourse, I think, is already well established and institutionally established in Singapore. Now you can answer all the hard ones that are left.
Well, one was the checklist, and actually you can make a checklist. At the end of my book, I made a checklist which is perhaps more applicable to my own country and to Europe than to here. But you can talk about what would be a more just housing policy, what would be a more just policy about ethnic diversity, what would be more just in terms of transportation. And some of these are fairly well fulfilled here, certainly in terms of inexpensive transportation. But there's sort of a problem here in that the inexpensiveness of the MRT and the bus system here depends on them being private companies which are allowed to bring in foreign labor and exploit them. If, in fact, you want to keep the prices low but pay the foreign workers better, then it will require a larger government subsidy. There is some government subsidy in the concessions there now, but that essentially to produce greater equity, you simply have to have more redistribution and more government intervention. And you can't simply see this as somehow a trade-off against growth, because it isn't necessarily a trade-off against growth. In fact, as one of the I think negatives about Singapore in terms of how the world sees it is Singapore is seen as a very sanitized, over-regulated place. And in fact, if it were a little less orderly and a little more lively, it might be more attractive to the kinds of competitive, innovative people that you would like to either retain here or attract here. But I think for each place you can make a checklist and say that in some places there's some things that need to be emphasized and in others other things. Certainly here the achievement of HDB would put it very high in terms of the housing checklist.
The question also is what would it have to do to be a global city?
Well, to be a global city, you would certainly need to have more cultural offerings than is currently the case.
Just buildings.
Right, and one of the things that I would be critical of is that a huge amount of investment has come from the government in terms of building very large venues which are dark about half the time, and is now spending an incredible amount of money on this sports stadium, which will not be used that much of the time either. And instead, there's very little investment in cultural programming, that is in bringing in foreign companies, if you want, but also providing livelihoods, fellowships, prizes, what have you, to indigenous creators of drama, of art, and so forth. I'm not sure if this isn't because there's a worry that they might say things that are out of turn, but that in order to, in fact, make your city more competitive and enhance Singapore's attractiveness in the world, I think there needs to be a loosening up. There was a question about minorities always being minorities, and this goes to the point Norman made earlier about your ethnic status is stamped on your identity card. The only way minorities stop being minorities is if they become Singaporeans. And what you see in the United States, which of course is a nation of immigrants, is that people who are Italians or Irish or Germans were, in the last century, identified as minorities. They were called, in fact, races, the Italian race. Now, they're not seen as minorities, they're just Americans. And that there is an absorption but that in order to have the absorption, you have to get away from having constantly identifying people. So that we were shocked when we first saw ads for housing that said things like no Chinese, or no, usually they say no Chinese because that's the largest group. But that because of the quota system in HDB, it reaffirms difference rather than obliterating it. And so gradually that, I don't think that the EIP can go all at once, but I think that gradually it has to really go away. John's question, I should mention that John Powers was my PhD student some years ago, and wrote a really wonderful thesis about the way in which innovation occurs. He looked at Dublin and Beijing and the way in which government intervention can promote innovative activity or not. And he found, as did some other of my students who looked at why certain cities did have clusters of innovative industries, that there really is that the existence of talented people is critically important, the existence of educational institutions, but it isn't somehow that everybody's sitting over coffee and exchanging ideas, which seems to be a cliche that's around. That's something of a digression. But the larger question of can there be transformative change? Transformative change is extremely difficult in any place. I think that being a city-state gives more leverage, but that what you get at some point is small changes lead to a transformative or qualitative change. Right now, New York, you may know, has elected a new mayor who campaigned very strongly on trying to alleviate inequality. He took the title of Dickens' book, A Tale of Two Cities, and said New York is a tale of two cities, of the rich and the poor, where his predecessor was quoted as saying, I just wish more Russian billionaires would come here because they create the jobs. Well, in fact, billionaires may create jobs, but they aren't necessarily very good ones, and unless you have more direct action, you're not going to alleviate the situation of those people who are worse off. But I think by gradual policies, you can, in fact, change things in a transformative kind of way and a more peaceful kind of way. The Little India riot has provoked here a great deal of soul-searching, but it seems primarily in terms of how do we keep order in Little India, rather than the larger question of how, in fact, we transform the situation of foreign workers so that this becomes a more just place. And if, in fact, the longer-term effect of the riot was to put in place more explicit policies for better representation, for better housing, for better safety measures, then these changes will eventually be, in fact, I think, transformative. But that certainly the viability of a place which will eventually become, as current things go, about half citizens and half not, would be really regression rather than progress.
Okay, we've unfortunately come to the end of this session. We've gone past the time, but I would like to just say that it's really always a pleasure to interact with visitors who are insightful, well-informed, well-intentioned, and Susan and Norman, you are among the best of them. So it's been a real delight. I hope it's been the same for you too. Will you please join me in thanking Susan and Norman?
Thank you, Prof. Susan and Norman Feinstein and Associate Prof. Tan for sharing your insights and experience with us. We would now like to invite Mr. Khoo, Executive Director of CLC, to present the panelists and moderator with a token of appreciation. Mr. Khoo, please.
I just read about this and thought, how can I get a copy? I really go through it. Thank you so much.
Just launched yesterday.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our lecture. We thank you for your participation, and do join us as we feature 3 more international renowned experts who will be in Singapore in March. Do stay tuned to CLC mailers and website for more details. We'll also be seeking your feedback through email, and we'll greatly appreciate if you could take a minute to help us improve the lecture series. Have a good evening, and we hope to see you again.